Up next on Outlook, we're going to have a conversation with Congressman Brett Guthrie, who represents the 2nd District of Kentucky as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. From growing global threats to domestic health crises to the veritable circus that is the national presidential primary, we're going one-on-one with Brett Guthrie. Stay with us. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Outlook. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're so glad you joined us. On the program, we're going to be talking with Congressman Brett Guthrie, who's been representing the 21 counties of Kentucky's 2nd District since he took office in January of 2009. He's a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, the Committee on Education and the Workforce with jurisdiction over energy, health care, telecommunications, and consumer product safety policies. In addition, Congressman Guthrie, I understand you've been traveling to Europe quite a bit to work with NATO. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the program.
Thank you.
But thanks for being here. How are you?
Doing very well, doing very well. I haven't been quite a bit, but I've been to a couple of meetings with for national security with the NATO. So we can talk about that. Yeah, it's interesting
definitely.
What's going on in Europe.
But let's talk right now that as we record this program from the studios here in Bowling Green, we're on the heels of the New Hampshire primary. And you know, as we've been looking at the pundits, the politicians, the historians, it seems like every election cycle, they're always trying to define and in some cases redefine party structures. I saw an interesting interview the other day with a senator from Nebraska, and they were asking him to define conservatism because he is an up-and-coming conservative leader. You've been in office now almost a decade. You know, we're inching. No, I can't.
Me either.
It's hard to believe, but how do you define Republican in this day and this time as Brett Guthrie?
You know, the Republican Party was founded on freedom of the individual. I mean, the Republican Party literally was founded by groups of people who said you couldn't believe that all men are created equal and believe it only applied to certain races of people, that it applied to everybody. And that's where Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party came from. And so, you know, my view is still that all men are created equal and should have the opportunity to improve themselves and move upward. And when I first ran for the state senate, which is even longer than a decade ago, and I never thought I'd be doing it this long, I remember my slogan was, and get it from an old church campfire song, but a common hope for tomorrow. And no matter who you are, no matter what color your skin or even the accent with which you speak, if you're in this country and you want your children to live a better life, that's the American dream, and that's participating in the American dream. Because you're not American by what you look like or what you sound like. You're American by, I think, the values that you have. And so you know, both parties do that, and I think it's how do you unleash the potential for people? It's interesting you ask that because one of the things that I've always thought about, a friend of mine named Kevin McCarthy, who's our majority leader, came back from a meeting in the Oval Office with the president one day, and he goes, you're not going to kind of almost stunned? This was probably 2011, maybe 2012, and said the president said, Kevin, this is a quote from Kevin.
President Obama.
I wasn't there, President Obama. I kind of view the world as a pie, and it's my opportunity to see that people get an equal share of the pie as they can. And I guess the best example today of that would be Bernie Sanders. As you look forward, is that, you know, we're going to keep the pie. And he said, no, Mr. President, our job is to make sure we grow pie. We produce more pies. People get a bigger slice. And you think about it, you know, the rich get richer, you hear a lot, and the rich have gotten richer over the last few years. But they did in the 1990s as well. The Clinton years, you know, the Clinton economy. The rich get richer. That happened, but everybody was doing better. And so that's what we need is an economy where everybody does better. And when you say the rich got richer, I mean Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, these names here, Steve Jobs, but they were creating products. They were growing the economy.
They were creating
putting
jobs.
People to work. And people, so like, you know, when you're looking at, it's like even in a family. If you got one pie and everybody's trying to fight over the slices, they fight over it. But if everybody's getting more and more because it's growing, and I think that's how do you unleash the American people? Because currently in Washington, it's overregulated. Everywhere you go, the number one issue that you see in businesses is finding employees that have the skills that they need for the workforce. And even with we have a low unemployment rate, we have a low labor participation rate. So even in this vicinity, you hear a lot of discussion about workforce development in this area because a lot of people are having trouble finding the right level of skills in the workers.
In the workforce.
But that, and then overregulation you hear, is that I can't do anything because the government's coming in.
The government's got their hand on there. I want to talk about that in the second segment, but let's finish up with this. Okay, so you brought up this analogy of a pie, and that's more in the making it equal for people. But let's look within the ranks of the Republican Party and just the degrees of republicanism.
Okay.
We've got the Tea Party, we've got more conservative, he's a little less, how does that shake out, and how does that affect what you do?
American history has been that way. We only have two parties. In Europe, you would have an environmental party, a labor party,
Sure.
a business party, particularly in Italy and some of those other countries, not so much England, they've kind of sort of three parties, but really two. And so within the two parties are coalitions of people that forming together. You have if you looked at Iowa, they always talked about the Christian conservatives, the values voters, the business voters, the farmers, the just conservatives, and the Democratic Party, environmentalists, and labor, which sometimes environmentalism goes against labor. This Keystone Pipeline would be an example,
Sure,
where
it's a good
unions are wanting the
example of
Keystone
Kentucky.
Pipeline. The president won't because of environmentalists. And so both parties are kind of coalitions of different groups of people, and so presidential primaries, you're seeing it in both parties.
You are
it's
saying-
kind of arguing, but it is both parties. It's not just Republicans.
Well, no, they're sharing the wealth for sure. How have you changed as a Republican in your tenure in the House of Representatives?
I think my principles and values are the same as when I went in. I mean, I think that I believe in inspiring people, I like to be aspirational instead of a lot of people. I've gotten some comments before, you're never really criticizing the other side too much, and I try not to do that because I think the best thing is be aspirational and move people forward and try to move the debate forward and the country forward. When you change, you realize you can't solve every single problem as a single legislator. You can push for it, but you can't just make it happen because our founding fathers didn't want one person to be able to make it happen. So how do you work within the system to get things done? I have one bill, I think, it might be the only one, if I could be corrected, that got passed that really fixed a substantial section of the president's health care bill, Obamacare, where it exempted small businesses from some mandates. And I was able to work with both sides of the aisle, with a good friend of mine on the other side of the aisle, and it unanimously passed the House and Senate. And the president signed it. We were hoping to do a signing ceremony with the president, but my understanding is he waited till after the news ended on Friday night, which you in the news business know that's the time you want to do something.
Yes.
If you don't want people to know about it, because he had to admit that a section of his law, which a lot more, but the section we worked with didn't work.
Didn't work.
And
And
but
so
being able to work with people, I think I've been consistent in being able to do that.
That part of the whole theory. We've got a caucus coming up in the state of Kentucky. We've got an interesting presidential primary underway. I asked you if you had a horse in that race, to which you replied.
My neighbor and our friend here was Rand Paul. He suspended his campaign and focusing on his Senate race. He's a great senator. I've enjoyed working with him, and I think he'll be successful in his reelection to the Senate, and glad that he's able to continue that way. In order for him to be able to do both at this point, the Kentucky Republicans chose to do a caucus. And the difference in a caucus and a primary, primaries are run by the Secretary of State, the county clerks. They're in law for nominating for major offices, so I have to be nominated through a primary. It can't be a caucus. But when you select, so we're really not selecting a presidential candidate. We're selecting delegates to go to the national convention. So, technically the national conventions, even though it's usually pro forma by the time we get to the conventions,
Right.
select the nominee. So in order to select delegates, you can do that through a caucus. So we were able to do that March the 5th. And some people are saying, well, here we are, March the 5th's coming, Senator Paul's not in the race. It's going to be a big effort for Republicans. I'm not dismissing that at all. And I'm going to volunteer to help because I think we all need to pitch in to help. But so March 1st is what they call the SEC primary, big southern states. And then all these candidates are going to roll out on March 1st on Wednesday morning and say, wow, we got Kentucky on Saturday.
We got it on
I think we're the
Saturday.
only one. And so all of a sudden, at least on the Republican side, I think the Democrats stuck with the primary. So it'll be in May. There should be, 3 or 4 candidates come steamrolling through Kentucky. And we're having our Lincoln Day dinner in Warren County on the Friday night before in hopes of getting a couple of these candidates.
Here, we're going to talk more about that. We've got to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll find out more about the upcoming caucus in Kentucky with U.S. Representative Brett Guthrie. Stay with us, won't you? Outlook continues. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're so glad you chose to stay with us. We're talking with U.S. Representative Brett Guthrie, who is hails hails from Bowling Green. I mean, he's a Bowling Green resident.
Not too far away from where we're sitting.
No, not too far at all. And we were talking before the break about the upcoming presidential primary, and of course you talked about your candidate out of the race, Rand Paul, has decided to suspend his race so that he could concentrate on his Senate re-election.
Exactly.
But could you help our audience get a better understanding of what we're talking about when we say caucus versus a primary, and why Kentucky is having one in March when the Democrats are waiting until May?
Well, the Democrats stuck with the primary. The state law says you can have a primary or a caucus for the purpose of selecting presidential delegates. So you're literally selecting people to go to the convention. In doing that, you'll vote for names and of presidential candidates, not names of delegates, but presidential candidates.
How competitive is that to be a delegate?
Well, you know, it's usually done with a party, kind of a caucus anyway, and it is usually there are people who it's expensive to go, and you pay your own way, so that kind of winnows some of it down. You're paying a few $100s a night for a hotel and whatever, but it's a reward. I mean, there are people here that I've known that've gone, that've been loyal Republicans, been around, and
it's an honor to be able
it's
to
an honor,
represent,
but you're really not free to vote for whoever you want to because party rules. You know, whoever wins the caucus
dictate.
Now we can actually, this can be more portioned. Before, it used to, whoever won the presidential primary, all the delegates had to vote for in the first ballot.
Okay.
And there's never been a second ballot. You hear these old stories of Abraham Lincoln winning in the 30th ballot and whatever, like Thomas Jefferson elected president in the House of Representatives in the 20-something ballot. But typically, the race is over by the time you get to, ours is in Cleveland. And so, but you go, and there are different caucuses. Ours is actually going to be throughout the day on Saturday. Check for the times, March the 5th.
Saturday, March
you
5th.
show up and you're actually going to cast a ballot. And we did that because one of the commitments Senator Paul made, he wanted to make sure if we did a caucus, we had a way to do absentee ballots. So out-of-state military could vote.
Okay.
So when you saw the caucuses in, at least the Democrat caucuses in Iowa, they actually would get into a high school gym, and everybody for Bernie Sanders get in this corner, everybody for Hillary Clinton get in this corner, and they would count. And if they were the same number at each corner, they would flip a coin to see who got the delegate. And ours is actually going to be people are going to come in and cast the ballots. You don't have to stay for.
Are we talking like a
4 or 5? It's going to be.
ballot
I think
or
it's
electronic?
Electronic.
Okay.
Well, you're going to circle like you do at
Okay.
voting now, and then you submit it, and I think that's how that works. Scott Lasley, who's a professor here, can tell you he's working on putting this together better than I. But the idea is it's going to be throughout the course of a day. But because it's a party-run function, there will be candidates there. They could be. I'm not saying about presidential candidates. We won't know their schedule till probably March the 2nd. And our hope
But
is they'll
there
come
is
to
the
our.
possibility
Oh,
that some of the
absolutely. I think
Republican-
they'll be in Kentucky somewhere.
Do you think Donald Trump would make
Well, I
his
think
way?
he'll still be in the race by March the 1st, if not all the way through. I mean, it depends on who's going to be in the race by
that time.
March the 5th. And I would assume Donald Trump, probably Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio seems to be. You know, then you got Jeb Bush, who has money to stay the course.
Well,
Because
we'll know
usually they
more.
start filtering out by that point.
Well-
Who depends on who wins New Hampshire.
Well, that's what I was just going to say. And again, if you're just joining us, we are taping this program from our Bowling Green studios before the New Hampshire primary. So probably when people see it, the primary, which is tomorrow,
Like
will
Chris
have
Christie,
happened.
Carly Fiorina, any of
Right,
those
who
can stay in
knows?
and that
Who
are
knows?
still in the race and be
But-
here. But I would guess it would be 3 or 4.
3 or
And
at
I'm not
least.
sure. At least I think Donald Trump would be one.
And you know, somebody may pop by the caucuses in
The caucuses,
in
or the
Kentucky.
night before we're having our Lincoln Day dinner, and so
That's right.
they could be
held in Warren
They
County.
could be here in Warren County.
Well-
but we won't. I mean, I'm saying that, but you won't know that
You
till
don't
probably
know
March 2nd or 3rd.
till it happens, but
Yeah.
something to look forward to. But you know, this whole thing gave Rand Paul the opportunity to continue his
Mm-hmm.
presidential bid while still running for re-election in the Senate.
Right.
So that was something the Republican Party agreed
Did
to
for
do.
that. But it's going to benefit us anyway. I think
that's-
even without him in the race, I think it's going to be. We're going to get to participate where we typically don't. Now this year could be odd, like it was in 2008 when Kentucky in the Democratic primary. If you remember, President Obama and Secretary Clinton were still in it. She came to Bowling Green and campaigned here in Bowling Green. But for Republicans, it's like Mitt Romney was decided probably early March. Now this year you have 3 or 4 that could still be in it in May, but probably not. So it gives us a chance to be part of the process.
Okay, you've been watching these presidential primaries. Does it seem like they've gotten louder over the years? They've gotten uglier, they've gotten meaner?
Well, I'm reading a book by John Meacham. I just met him the other day on Thomas Jefferson. And I'm not sure we could get louder or more partisan or more different than Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. They went at it. And until they were friends in the Revolutionary War. And then from the 1790s through the Jefferson presidency were just bitter enemies. And about 1811, 1812, they said, we need to become friends again, and did. Thank goodness, because they have great letters between the two that build a lot of that history. But you had the Alien and Sedition Acts, written by the Federalists under John Adams to keep they call them Republicans then, but it's not the same party. James Madison was leader of that group. You got these guys who are they have icons in D.C. They have the statues in D.C. Who are just going at Alien Sedition Acts, arresting people for saying bad things about each other. But they were fighting over big things.
What do you mean they were fighting over big things?
They were fighting over the federalism versus states' rights. I mean, there was just these arguments about where is the level of government. Thomas Jefferson would say that John Adams wanted a monarchy to come back. And so they were really fighting over big issues, the direction of the country. They sorted it out. And you look at Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. We sorted out in the end. And we're better for it.
These are the guys that put that Constitution together.
They put the Constitution and tried to figure out how much it limited them from one way or the other.
I mean, when you put it in that context, so you're saying, maybe history does repeat itself, or it's not as...
Well, it's not new. What's different is how quickly the information spreads and how quickly it's on TV every night and people can watch it. But our founding fathers fought over big issues. We're fighting over what level of government? That's what this campaign really is breaking down to. If you look at Bernie Sanders and the way he's bringing Secretary Clinton along, that government's going to make everything free, going to do things for you, going to make things happen, versus another view, hopefully, is that government is going to let you empower yourself and move forward and try to be all you can be. To steal from an old term when I joined the Army,
be all you can be.
But that's the kind of the concept that we're still arguing over, which really was Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, not the same arguments about it, but the same, what's the role of the central government?
We may never know what the role of the central government is as we continue to see it.
The people will keep this, and that's the thing, Jefferson, people can govern themselves. People will figure this out. In the Adams, he always said, want to go to monarchy, but basically we need the elites from Harvard to figure this out for people. And Thomas Jefferson, which I guess I'm now defending Thomas Jefferson, people would say he's a founder of what I said Republican. James Madison would say the beginning of the Democratic Party, but they were saying, people can govern themselves. They can figure this out, and these are issues worth fighting over.
They're issues worth fighting over, and
and America's better off because they did.
And that was our history lesson. But what about,
well, that's what I'm in the middle of reading now. I'm reading our Founding Fathers.
Because
I have people a lot of times talk to me about the Founding Fathers and the Constitution and what does it mean, and I've gone back and I've read I've James Madison, all the guys in John Adams' book and so forth, because I just said, what did these guys really intend? What's interesting? Thomas Jefferson came back from Paris to become Secretary of State, so he wasn't there during the Constitution. So he sent to James Madison, what should I do as Secretary of State? What's my power? And he goes, you have the power to do everything in foreign affairs except for the things you have to send to the Senate, which they have to approve treaties. He goes, and be very careful about what you decide has to be. So even James Madison, who designed the Constitution, was telling him that executive power, be very careful with it and don't cede it to the legislature. But I'm on the other side of that debate as a legislator. I think that we have a lot more authority than the president's letting us take. And so, but those arguments are
they're still here.
They've gone back since it started right after, or at the end of George Washington's presidency when it started.
Okay, let's talk about your constituency. 21 counties, it runs the gamut. But you have a strong foothold with rural voters. So, you're there in Washington, D.C., you get home, you get to go and shake hands and see what's happening. What are the issues that these people are?
People are concerned, first and foremost, about security.
And what do you mean by security?
And when I say security,
Like
I hear a lot about like the homeland security, what's happening in the Middle East, what's going on with ISIS, the threat after what happened in Paris and San Bernardino. People really started talking about it, and it's it hits home. I mean, it's when things are happening overseas and you see what I think when ISIS came on the scene, where it got in the conscience of people, was when they did the public beheadings and the burning of the pilot from Jordan in the cage. Sure. And it just brought home how these people have disregard life whatsoever. ISIS would prefer to kill most Muslims too. I mean, it's the thing. So if you're a Muslim who doesn't believe the way they believe, that they think that you're apostate and are worthy of death.
And worthy of death. We got to take another little short break here, but when we come back, now you've been traveling some to Europe, working with NATO. We're going to find out more about that when our conversation with U.S. Representative Brett Guthrie continues here on Outlook. Stay with us. Outlook continues here on WKU-PBS. I'm Barbara Deeb, and I hope you're enjoying our conversation, our one-on-one with U.S. Representative Brett Guthrie. Before the break, we were talking about your constituency and just, you know, what are people thinking? You said security, and I didn't know if you meant they want a roof over their heads and they want to be able to pay their mortgage, but you're talking
Well, they
more
want both,
about,
but
they
the
do.
national security, what the
Homeland.
federal government wants for them, expects from the federal government, is that we provide for the common defense. I mean, that is what the Constitution says, and that's what people expect the federal government to be able to provide a safe and secure
environment.
Yeah.
But here in Bowling Green, we are unique in that we have a really well-established refugee center. And many refugees, many wonderful people have come to this community as a result of its
and added
efforts.
to our community in unbelievable ways.
However, the Syrian refugee issue at present is so different than any of the others that we've had.
Well, the question is, and we brought the FBI director before, it wasn't my committee, Congress, and he couldn't, you go through about a 2-year process from a Syrian refugee camp to be able to come here as a Syrian refugee. And he said, we really don't know through all this screening if we're really getting it right. So we wanted to pause it to see if we could get it right.
So then you think we should continue with
Well, I think we should, what I voted to do was actually stop the refugee coming in from Syria until we had assurances from the FBI director, which a lot of people have a lot of confidence in. I know it's a political appointee, but he's a professional, both sides of the aisle, to say that we have a system in place. What we did stop, though, so we have, I think, over 30 countries, most of them in Europe, that you can come here without a passport. So if you're a British citizen with a British passport, without a visa.
Right.
So if you're a British citizen, French citizen, you can come here without a visa. And so if you remember in Paris, one was a refugee, the rest were French citizens or with French passports.
You're talking about the terrorist
The
attack
terrorists,
in
even,
France.
and so if you're
Turns out.
a family from, because of the old relic of colonialism, they have freedom, a lot of them freedom to move within Commonwealth nations. So you could be, 2 people from Pakistan who move to Britain, have a child, so the child gets a Pakistani passport and a British passport. Let's say that, and they're Islamic, and this son or daughter becomes radicalized. Not saying they all, but one becomes radicalized. Then they have the freedom to move to the United States and back just on a passport. And that's what we did vote to fix in the omnibus.
In the omnibus bill. You've been traveling to Europe some. Where in Europe? And you're working with NATO?
Well, not traveling a lot to Europe, but I am there's a NATO parliament. So during the NATO treaties that right after the World War II, they created the North American Treaty Organization. North Atlantic Treaty Organization against the old Soviets. That was the idea behind it, but there was a NATO parliament. Selected, it was picked by the speaker, so I'm a member of the NATO parliament. And we meet in Brussels. That's where the NATO headquarters is.
Brussels, Belgium. But you brought up something. It was created at a time when we had a Cold War.
Oh, we were
Russia.
the Soviet. That's when it was created.
But are we going back to that place? Is the ice slowly melting?
Well, it's very interesting when we get there, because the Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but they attend. So does Georgia, the Republic of Georgia. And so we're going to be meeting with them, and they're very concerned about Putin's actions. But members of NATO are like Latvia, Lithuania. I mean, there are countries that are members of NATO that we rushed to bring in the early 90s when the wall came down. And now Putin he's encroached on Georgia, encroached on Ukraine. He hasn't on those within the NATO alliance. Because if you're a member of NATO, attack on one's attack on all.
So who is our biggest threat then, in your opinion? When I say
I think Putin's a threat. I think absolutely.
Russia? To the U.S.?
To the U.S. and then ISIS. I mean, Putin, he wants to undermine NATO. He wants to undermine the European Union. The thing that's kind of really saved us more now than any recently is the cheap oil prices, because he's been able to fund everything he does on energy. And so one of my big issues within this NATO conference and coming back, but we finally got it done in the omnibus, is to let us export energy, because that will help our European friends. Because think about if you're David Cameron or if you're Angela Merkel, and all of a sudden we can do these boycotts or we can embargo or boycott Russia, but our energy prices are going to double and triple. I mean, that's real hardship on those countries. But now that the prices have dropped because of technology, the ability, and we have more oil and natural gas than Saudi Arabia.
True, but we need another half hour. We're just about out of time, but we talk about oil prices.
But we also deal with, within this NATO, is the immigration coming from across the Mediterranean, because now that they have a European Union, they have open borders. And so if somebody can come across the Mediterranean, get into Greece or one of these other countries, well, they can just work their way to Germany. And that's what we're having. So what I'm going to be interested, because there'll be parliamentarians or congressmen from these European countries, is how they're dealing internally. As you've seen a lot of stuff in the news about, refugees coming into Germany particularly, and how they're handling that moving forward. Having said that, and I'd say this to people all the time, I think we've had a good experience. There has been issues with the refugee center. I mean, the languages in our school system that we have to deal with. But I think overall, our community's better for the people who moved into here. I mean, some of our favorite restaurants they go to are, and they've become small business people.
They've really contributed.
They've really contributed to the community. And so we got to be careful how we talk about refugees, but we have to make sure, as we're dealing with Syrian refugees or refugees from several countries over there, that we make sure that people come here, people that are going to be safe. We need to keep our country adequately screened and then welcome, and hopefully buy into the American dream and get back to our original theme that they want to move their families forward.
That's
right.
We'll
see that.
We'll see that. Listen, promise you'll come back and see us soon.
I'd love to be back anytime.
All right. Thank you so much. We've been talking with U.S. Representative Brett Guthrie, and that is going to wrap it up for this week's edition of Outlook. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're glad you joined us.